Welcome everyone to our webinar, Turn On, Tune In, Burnout. This is part of a wider series of webinars and articles by our Gate 1 team, starting early in 2021, where we talked about building personal and team resilience. And the content today will hopefully help with knowing how to balance leading change with supporting your people. But first, some introductions so you know who's speaking to you today. My name is Lucy. I am really delighted to be here as this is a topic that I really believe in. I have both an academic and a practical background in psychology. I studied a master's in clinical mental health before going on to research resilience at the Institute of Psychiatry, and I've worked as an assistant psychologist in the NHS as well. I've supported leadership teams as a people change specialist for 8 to 9 years, and I'm also on my way to becoming an accredited coach.
Thanks very much, Lucy. So hello, good morning. My name is Stasha. I've got 25 years of experience, both as a leader in industry, but also as a people and change management consultant across a whole bunch of industries and geographies. I'm a ProSci certified change practitioner, and I'm fascinated by culture coming from a Polish, French, German, and British family. Yes, I love Eurovision. And I'm also passionate about trying to understand behaviour and how we can leverage that understanding to make meaningful change happen.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stasha. And we work for a company called Gate 1, which is part of the Havas Group. And for those who aren't familiar with us, we're a change and transformation consultancy that supports clients on their most complex challenges, which can be really diverse. So strategy, digital, customer transformation, or reimagining your operating model. And within our people change practice, we focus on change management, culture change, and leadership development. And it's within that remit that we join you today. And what is today? We are going to set the scene against the current context that we're in, both with the pandemic and all the organisational change that we know is going at full throttle in businesses. We're going to look at burnout, what it is and how it manifests in the workplace. The majority of this webinar will be on that third bit, how to lead change in a burnout context and minimising the risk of burnout. And then we'll stay online for some Q&A. As we said, we can't hear you or see you, but please do use the chat for comments and for questions. We are looking at it as we go. And just a final admin note, we are recording this. All right. Before we get into it, I'm just going to ask you to exhale. Let out your breath and drop your shoulders. I wonder how often we stop to do that. And pacing ourselves and our energy has a lot to do with today's topic. But first, what context are we joining this webinar in? Stasha, over to you.
Thanks, Lucy. Okay, so it has been a tough couple of years where everyone has kept calm and carried on through the uncertainty of the pandemic. And many of us thought it was only going to be a couple of weeks of disruption at first, if you think back, and then maybe a couple of months, but few of us could have predicted the last 2 years. And the truth is the ups and downs and relentless effort has left many of us feeling burnt out and a bit virus fatigued, right at the point now where things are starting to stabilise, touch wood. And many organisations are now ready to press forwards with either new or previously delayed programmes of change. It's a perfect storm in the making. It's worth acknowledging how much new research and innovation is happening globally around how to support people in the workplace given this context. And we're really excited by the potential this has to transform how we all think about change and people support in organisations. So we're now going to explore this through the eyes of two individuals, Adrian and Pandora. Okay, meet our two protagonists for today's session. So Pandora, at the start of the pandemic, my team and I rolled up our sleeves to make it work. We worked long and hard for the first year and achieved so much. It's like we were all running on adrenaline, a bit like me this morning. Year 2. It started to feel more like kryptonite, and I'm so tired and I can't concentrate. I'm easily overwhelmed. and I've been getting teary for no reason, which isn't like me. I started to get headaches too. So that's a little bit about Pandora. She's having a bit of a tough time. I'm now going to move on to Adrian. So let's meet Adrian. So when lockdown happened, we had to juggle homeschooling as well as working from home. I survived on 5 hours sleep a night for nearly 2 years because my wife was in the vulnerable category. So we couldn't even get help with the boys from our family because most of them work in the NHS. 2 years later, things are getting better, but I'm not myself. I've become grumpy, irritable, and always seem to think the worst. And I keep waking up at 4 a.m. having anxiety attacks. I'm pretty miserable. So you may be familiar with the term superhero syndrome. And it's where long-term success and adrenaline, driven by that relentless urgency, can turn into personal kryptonite and become damaging to someone's well-being, as we've just heard from our superheroes, Adrian and Pandora. So my question to you is, how many superheroes do you have in your teams? So before we get started, we're curious to know what your own experiences or observations are of burnout challenges. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Stasha. Yeah, so this may be viewed as a little mean because we haven't actually told you the formal definition, but everyone has a different take on burnout. And before we kind of take you through what we've defined it as, we're interested to see your experiences of it. So if I can ask you to pick up your phones, open your camera app and scan the QR code, it should take you to an answer sheet. Or Stasha has dropped a link in the chat if that's easier for you. Now, look, there are no wrong answers, and it's also totally anonymous, so it doesn't matter even if it was wrong. What are your own observations and experiences of burnout? How are you performing? What are you doing? How are you acting? I'll just give you a moment to click on that and enter a few words. Then as you do that, I'm going to just move on and see what we've got coming through. Fantastic. So I'm looking over here at my other screen, working late at night, lack of energy, anxious, feeling overwhelmed. So what's really interesting here is from the out, you've got difference there in terms of actual behaviours that spring to mind for people versus feelings, tired, exhausted, lack of energy, but also that working late at night, wanting to quit. That's not what we want at all from our employees. Gosh, loads of stuff there, no work-life balance. Is there anything jumping out for you, Stasha?
Can't focus outside work. Fuzzy brain.
It's really interesting. And actually, that word fuzzy just triggered something. So I think what's useful here is all of this stuff has a real business impact. You know, this is not a woman fuzzy conversation. This is a business imperative that people need to manage and people need to help their teams manage. Loads of stuff there. Thanks so much, everyone, for contributing. And I think I read when preparing for this that McKinsey predicts that organizational challenges of burnout are likely to continue. So we're likely to see this stuff more in the next year or two as you know, the working impact catches up with us.
It's interesting that the words overwhelmed, relentless, and anxious are starting to join irritable in the middle there.
Fantastic. Right. Really interesting. Well, listen, that link stays open. If you're still grappling with it, that's no problem. We'll have a look and see what that final word cloud looks like. But let's move on. As we've seen, you all have some familiarity with burnout, and stories of it are becoming increasingly common. Yet, many misconceptions do exist about it. And this might be that it's only due to workload, say working too hard or too long, that it's the individual's fault, so someone needs to say no more, or that it either needs kind of very long leave or will go away with a day or so of rest, so kind of that extreme. What we want to do is bust some of those myths with this webinar, which is Gate 1 views, but heavily grounded in NHS guidance and research. So, burnout. It is officially defined as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And it's characterized by 3 dimensions: exhaustion, mental distance or negativism, and reduced efficacy. Now, there's three things really that we wanted you to take away from this slide. The first is that people understand burnout as different things and can be dismissive of it. The second is that because of that, this formal definition is really important. And the World Health Organization coining it, actually as recently as 2019, was a significant move because it helped dismantle that belief that it's nothing serious. The third thing to take away from this slide is that it is specifically an occupational phenomenon occurring in the workplace. It's not a defined medical definition. So that's the formal definition. How is it really experienced? What Stasha and I have done is grouped symptoms defined by the World Health Organization into 4 buckets and thought about what the individual experiences versus what the observer sees, because that is not necessarily the same thing. So these are the buckets of symptoms. You've got work-related alienation, you've got emotional exhaustion, physical symptoms, and reduced performance. Now, I'm not going to list every symptom possible. I'm just going to whiz you through this using our protagonists to give you a flavour. So work-related alienation. We heard some of this from Pandora, where she talked about feeling easily overwhelmed. She might also be cynical or indifferent about her work. But what you'd observe as Pandora's manager is maybe a reluctance to set objectives or a withdrawing from responsibility. For emotional exhaustion, Adrian spoke about being grumpy and irritable. He might also be unmotivated or certainly less engaged than he was, and possibly have feelings of hopelessness or feeling really pessimistic. What you might observe as Adrian's manager is that he turns up to fewer team meetings, or maybe that his negative change in mood is prolonged and he's not just having a bad day. Physically, Pandora mentioned teariness and headaches. And actually the emotion leading to teariness is sometimes expressed more physically as well, with hunched shoulders or even stomach and back aches. And she's probably exhausted, maybe due to insomnia. But what you'd observe is maybe just an increased reference to having a sleepless night or feeling unwell. And finally, we heard Pandora mention lack of concentration. And when you're on the way to becoming burnt out, you do feel less productive, both at home and in the workplace. And you lose the ability to think creatively, and notably your memory's worse. And this is actually a bit scary because you feel like you're losing your mind and there's nothing you can do about it. What you might observe is what you perceive as scattiness, or maybe an inability to make simple decisions. And you might get more requests for help that Pandora is normally proficient in. So people suffering from work fatigue and burnout show signs of some or all of these symptoms. And the onus is on leaders to find a balance between maintaining that sense of urgency and momentum without it turning into kryptonite, and ensuring their employees' well-being is prioritised. So let's not ignore, there is an element of individual responsibility. There are tactics that I need to do, my employees need to do to help themselves, but it's not up to the individual alone. Burnout is a larger issue that requires solutions at the company's leadership and manager level. Now, before we tell you how, permit me just one more slide to reiterate why this is important. We know the implications of burnout. We know it increases sick leave. We know it increases the likelihood of quitting. The statistic that Stasha and I wanted to emphasize today is today's employee can absorb half as much change before becoming fatigued as they could manage in 2019. Half as much change as they could. So if you take a workforce that's already fatigued by change, fatigued by the pandemic, and they're getting more and more stressed, how effective is that really going to make your transformation? Just take a moment to reflect on whether you think this is playing out in your workplace. And the good news is you can lead change in a way that goes a long way to minimise the risk of burnout whilst maintaining that momentum that we know is necessary in organisations. So what on earth can you do, Stasha?
Thank you, Lucy. So while you're reflecting, let me share with you, an obvious solution tends to be to encourage more rest. So take a holiday. if only, or set sights on short-term goals. And whilst they are helpful options, there's more that we can do. But the first step is understanding burnout better. And important research that helped spur the WHO's definition of burnout that Lucy's just been through was conducted by one of the foremost experts. So Christina Maslach, the author of The Truth About Burnout. Maslach and her team have identified 6 ways in which an individual can experience something called a job-person mismatch. And those factors that they found could create conditions more likely to result in burnout. So the bottom line is, understanding these will help us to start address the root causes of burnout itself. So I'm now going to go through those 6 factors. Let's have a look. So lack of control, that's really around things like moving goalposts and micromanagement, sometimes because organisations don't trust their people to work from home, perhaps. There could be unclear priorities and maybe that dust of chaos that I think we're all familiar with. Lack of community. So this can be around those feelings of isolations that I think most of us can relate to, that lack of belonging and that longing for an actual coffee with somebody and maybe a little bit of gossip. The third one is around insufficient rewards. So that may be about money, but it might just be around recognition and thanks. And then the fourth one, work overload. So too much to do, not enough time or people, and everything seems urgent. Conflict in values. So interestingly, where people feel the employer isn't doing the right thing, that can be a really powerful trigger for people to start looking for another job. And I know that came up in the word cloud when we were looking at that. And then finally, absence of fairness. So again, it might be about money, but typically it's about things like lack of recognition or engagement in important changes and decisions that actually impact them. So looking at these 6 factors, how can you run your organisation in a way that minimises the risk of burnout? Well, we're going to look at that and we're going to tackle each one of them from 3 perspectives. So you might not be surprised. We're going to start with the actual experience of Adrian or Pandora. The second perspective will be from the centre of your organisation or your change programme and how you can mitigate that experience. And that centre, if I want to define it, it could be programme leaders or strategy or portfolio teams or a change centre of excellence. Or the HR team, for example. And then thirdly, how local leaders can mitigate the factors. So what can people do locally? And that might be workstream leads, operational managers, programme teams, those kind of groups. Before we move on, it is worth recognising that no one size fits all. The application of the factors of minimising burnout in a change programme will really depend on your organisational strategy, culture, and your current people profile. But the good news is the model is universally helpful to encourage us to explore what will work in our own context. It will give you lots of great ideas. So without further ado, we're going to start with Pandora and lack of control. So her personal experience. There's so much going on that her manager is micromanaging her and others, and everything seems super chaotic and urgent. She feels out of control. She's got no idea what will happen next or what she'll be asked to do. She doesn't really know what direction they're going in because things keep changing and life is really fluid. So she can't plan or prioritise anything. Lucy, what do we think transformation centres can do to mitigate Pandora's situation?
Well, I think I've got 2 things, Sasha. The first is get a portfolio view of your change. And that allows you not only to know everything that's going on, but bundle those change releases with a single clear overarching narrative. And you can work with programme teams to reduce feelings of chaos from multiple communications or even conflicting communications. So that portfolio view of change will help you to do that. And then within that, give people options for how they absorb that change.
Ooh, options for how they absorb that change. What does that really mean, Lucy?
Yeah, look, psychology tells us that humans are control freaks, okay? A lot of anxiety stems from that feeling of a lack of control. Now, I may not have a choice about what change happens in my workplace, but if I'm given a choice about how to consume information about that change or upskill myself, it gives me a sense of control and I feel more settled. So have a think about different working styles and learning needs. Where can you give people videos to watch or versus a newsletter to read? Who might want a formal training course versus a kind of grab and go article to help them in the moment as they need help? So by giving them choice of how they access that information gives them control. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, that does make sense. Thank you. And if I think about what that means locally for local leaders, obviously there's that, the stuff that they can just do, encourage people to take breaks and holidays, and setting short to medium term direction and goals to help them with that priority piece. But really, I think look for opportunities to empower people. So fostering that environment of trust and respect. And I know the word empowerment can be massively overused. It certainly has during my career, but it's about trying to give people ownership and control of certain things. So, setting up groups to tackle specific issues, for example, or even feedback forums. And then I think, this is a really interesting idea, and it's something that we used to do many years ago, but it's become useful again, and that's creating chapters of change. So it's about opening up a change, doing it, and then closing it with celebration, lessons learned, or some kind of reflection session so that people feel like there's chunks or chapters of change. It can really help. We're going to move on now, and we're going to focus on Adrian's experience of lack of community. Lucy, over to you.
Thanks, Sasha. And just to remind everyone that if you've got questions or you want us to repeat something as we go through, then throw it in the chat and we'll get to it once we finish the section. Okay, here is how Adrian experiences lack of community. He's wary of going back to the office because he's been isolating to protect his wife, but his team is going in and he doesn't want to be the only one interacting via a screen. His team has also changed and there are new people, so he feels disconnected and like he doesn't belong in the same way as he did before. And lack of community is really about losing that positive connection with colleagues. On the converse side, feeling like we belong is that protective factor against burnout. So even if team structures aren't affected, I think it's worth highlighting that our digital ways of working have increased that sense of isolation recently. So what can our change centres do about this, Sasha?
Great question. So there are three things. The first one is that essentially they can harness the fact that going through something difficult together is like a shared struggle. So that shared struggle can build really deep connections and that sense of cohesion. And sometimes we call them war stories or the glory days. I'm sure you've come across a few, Lucy.
I have, but I don't repeat them on the webinar, Sasha. No, but really though, it's a great point. And this shared experience idea is important, and we can build on that by asking leaders to foster this environment of psychological safety, and that will encourage people to share their struggle. Psychological safety is building a trusting team that can connect and support each other through change. And it's actually one of the most common questions I get asked: how on earth do I do this? It's such a nebulous concept. And really, as a manager, you can do this by being honest and showing vulnerability yourself. Everyone can have a bad day, or everyone can be a bit worried about something. But you can then build that opportunity for teams to share, perhaps by putting in 5 minutes at the start of a team call just to ask how everyone is doing. And that cuts across the incredibly task-focused mindset that we normally have, especially with our scheduled calls.
Yeah, and it is interesting, Lucy, especially as we transition to hybrid working, as I think we are at the moment. The thing is that people might feel differently about returning to an office. Things like using public transport might be an issue for some. And it might be exciting on one hand. I've certainly felt this myself going into the office. It's great to get back to the office and see people and actually, pop to one of the many coffee shops that are out there that I haven't visited for a long time. But on the other hand, it is worrying, and I do find myself stressing out a little bit getting on the tube. And people should be able to be open about those feelings. It's reality, and being able to talk about it makes a massive difference. And I think also from a community perspective, it's going to be important for all of us to consider both the people who are working from home, whether it's part-time working from home or full-time working from home, as well as those who are physically present in an office, and how we maintain the connection with both of those types of groups.
Yeah.
Because it will be really easy to slip into just connecting with people face to face, for example. But the new normal hybrid working means that we need to be able to flex more than we did before. And that will be a new challenge, I think, and certainly many people on the call have experienced it already. Okay, so the second thing that I wanted to focus on really in this space is around co-creation of solutions. So talked a little bit about it in the previous slide. Lifting the lid on some of the stickiest issues in your programme, and of course, within parameters, giving people the opportunity to understand the problem and actually be at the heart of creating the solution. It's a win-win because you get more diverse input and early views of what won't work, as well as creating that sense of ownership, team working and belonging that people need from a community perspective.
So at the team or local level, that might mean using your shared struggle or collective problem solving to co-create resolutions needed within your specific context.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. And then the final point on this factor is around making it people-centric. And so providing that kind of people-centric support. And I think we've seen a lot of this through the lockdown period. But moving forwards, there's things like change clinics, friendly hypercare teams, and having that social wellness focused kind of opportunity or sessions where people, you can ask for like a 0 out of 10 for happiness ratings, for example, or just chat about how people are, depending on how cheesy you're willing to be. There's an example of, I've worked at a big pharma company and we've had a Friday how are you call on a regular basis. Could you schedule something like that after this webinar for this Friday and see how that goes? And also, from a campaign perspective, can you develop your engagement campaigns that really focus on the kind of people journey and sharing stories rather than just being kind of fact. So those are some examples. Lucy, have you got any others that will help bring this to life?
Just an example. I was working for a FTSE 100 kind of medtech organisation, and there was a global transformation going on which hit lots of different countries, so lots of different languages, lots of different cultures, and there was no way that me as the lone change manager could tailor the change experience for all those different groups of change audiences. So I put in place these change health checks where we had a standard recommended change plan or change management strategy, equipped all the leaders with it, and then I have one-to-ones with them, say on a fortnightly basis, to think about or help them think about what's the personality of their team, what are the particular nuances that they're feeling, and how can we tailor those points so that it's more effective for them and they can continue to build that team cohesion for them. And then the leaders went and did it, and that way you could have a consistent change approach at the top, but the cascade down reached really far out into the ground through these one-to-one change health checks.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I'm really interested to hear what people in the call have been doing and things that they find really help to build that like of community, or build a community, not a build community. So do use the chat if you've got really good examples or things that you want to share with each other. It'd be really great to see some of those popping up as we move on to the next slide. So have a think and please do share, because it's really interesting for us to see what else is out there as well. Okay, thanks Lucy. We're going to move on now to insufficient reward, and we're coming back to Adrian. So Adrian's still having a tough time. Over to you, Lucy.
I really feel for Adrian on this one, Stasha. He recently completed a challenging piece of work and he was really proud of it, but his manager did not acknowledge this. He knows there's lots going on, he knows that they're busy, but he's starting to feel invisible and it's really demotivating. And I think insufficient reward, remember, is not just about money, it's about wanting more recognition or a greater sense of pride in doing something well or important. And I think actually, Sasha, we don't need to separate change centres and then local managers and leaders here. It is kind of how you recognise someone is the same where you sit. So thinking about them together, have you come across this before in a workplace? What would you recommend?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, certainly I reflect back to my time when I worked for Centrica and British Gas, and, when there were big change programs, what could be super exciting were the opportunities that they brought. So that's things like valuable personal development opportunities for capable people in your team. So those new and different roles in projects where people are able to develop new skills and experience, they can really open doors for people's careers and be a massive positive experience. The second one is around purpose. And I know, again, it's one of those really popular words of the moment, but actually it makes a lot of sense. So just by knowing that you're working towards a common goal and that you're on the right path, your body will release dopamine, and that helps us to feel pleasure. It also helps us to strive and to focus. So remember to affirm and reaffirm with your colleagues and teams that you are working on something important, and bring that purpose into people's jobs. It makes such a difference. And then recognition, right? So we've all heard this before, but it is about recognizing the small things. And it's better to do the small things than it is just one big celebration at the end. So say thank you often and mean it. And also try and be specific. So it's nice to say you're a great team, but it's better to say why they're a great team. So, the last few days you've really prioritized effectively. And as a result, we've met this deadline. It's because you've really focused and made sure that we were doing the right things. And you can inject a bit of fun and generate some competition as well. So I don't know if you come across gamification, but it's really about looking for opportunities to kind of compete a little bit and look for the most of something, or the fastest, or the first. And that can just help with that kind of celebration. And then finally, there's something called, very formal phrase, the anticipatory principle. And if I'm honest, until I came to this webinar, it wasn't something that I'd heard of. But actually, I do recognise what it is, just not the terminology. It's where we're thinking further ahead and more broadly. So being proud of what you're going to achieve before you've actually done it. And I found that the public sector and some ex-public sector organisations tend to be great at this. So the teams will self-nominate for awards on a regular basis, even when they're in the middle of a programme, rather than waiting until they get to the end. So they've definitely got something to look forward to.
Yeah, I love this idea of the anticipatory principle. Research shows us that our behaviour in the present is influenced by the future we anticipate. So the more positive and hopeful your image of the future, the more positive the present day. So we can use this principle as leaders by saying to your team, I am grateful for having you on my team and for the work I know you're going to do over the next few months. And this has a really positive effect because it paints a picture for them, so they see themselves being part of that successful team in the future. And actually, what I found is a little trade secret. This is particularly helpful, a particularly helpful way to make people feel rewarded when they haven't actually delivered anything yet. So if you're at a stage in your program where you feel it's a bit awkward to celebrate success because of where it's at, that's normal. Use the anticipatory principle to thank people for what they will do.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the power isn't in the rewards themselves, really. It's about what the reward represents. It's that recognition, the manager praise, and that intrinsic feeling that an employee's contributions are valued. That's where most employee motivation really comes from. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the fourth factor, which is work overload. So we're going to hear from Pandora. So Pandora, she's never done. There's so much to do and everything is urgent. A couple of team members have left, but no projects have been paused. Her calendar is relentless with meetings every 30 minutes, and she's no time to eat, to leave her desk for a break, or to get exercise. Can relate to this a little bit sometimes, Lucy. How about you?
Sasha, this resonates with me a lot. And this is also really common in large-scale change. So what can centres do? I want to emphasise the word subtraction. Actually, I think we need more subtraction in our lives. When striving to improve, we overwhelmingly add. And actually, stepping away from our workplace context, how many of your New Year's resolutions were doing more of something rather than stopping? So How can we apply this in the workplace? I've said it before, I'll say it again. Review your portfolio, get that portfolio view of change. And then you can see, are there less critical projects that can be put on hold? Or are some deadlines arbitrary and can they be relaxed, giving a bit more time to do something? And maybe you can prioritize based on what's possible for audiences to absorb, not just what's possible to deliver. And you've got to be real about that. And the other thing you can do once you've reviewed your portfolio is be really clear in communications about what's not changing and about what's stopping. What about things that aren't stopping? I hear you protest. Yeah, there is lots going on. So do you know if multiple projects and programs are asking a lot from the same group of people? And how can you put in extra support for them if none of that can be stopped? And then also actively include moments of pause, offload or reflection within the programme. So this might be a survey, it might be a graffiti wall for people to add comments to, it might be a simple exhale at the start of each meeting, like we did for this one. The current client I'm at, a large retailer, the CFO has actually sent a wellbeing hour invite between 12 and 1. And you can use that to either step away from your desk, you can use it for some head down, productive working if you want, but there's no meetings. And that expectation has come from the top. It's the chief financial officer that's done that. So that's a really good way that space is just created in the day.
Yeah, and that can be done locally as well, Lucy. So, I call it a charter, whether it's a wellbeing hour or a list of do's and don'ts. It's a set of expectations set usually from the top, whatever that means. But essentially, it's giving people permission to put their wellness first. And it really supports healthy working habits. And of course, leaders need to walk the walk as well. It's no good, just sending a charter out and then ignoring it. A couple of other things that local teams can do as well. So, we may know this historically, but I think it's still relevant and probably more relevant now, which is when you're doing a major change, you should really be assuming that there's going to be a massive dip in productivity. It might be brief, but it's going to be there. And it's where people are learning and kind of building up to kind of speed. And it's really important to expect it and to plan and manage the workload and the workforce plans accordingly. If you just ignore it, then it is going to cause you and everybody else a lot of stress and pressure, which they can really do without now. So that's a key thing. And then finally, really think about preparing the line managers earlier to be able to absorb the change themselves, so that they can then lead it. And that might be simply just giving them, a week before everybody else, a briefing and a Q&A session, just so that they've got a bit more space and time to be in the right headspace and to feel prepared. So again, we're going to come to the chat actually. Work overload isn't new, although it's more intense as a result of the context that we're in. So what ideas do you guys have? And feel free to pop those in the chat. I keep checking it from time to time and seeing what's coming up. So please do feel that you can share. It's really interesting and useful for us as well. Nearly there, guys. So we're now going to look at conflict in values. And this is a particular favourite of mine. And we're going to look at it from Pandora's experience. So Pandora, she's supposed to care about her people, but when pushed to decide between accepting a piece of work to generate revenue or rejecting deferring to avoid putting her team under even more pressure when they're already at breaking point, she's told to accept the work, and she knows it will push people over the edge. So Lucy, what have you seen centres do which will help with this?
So I've just got one example actually, and I thought it was so effective that I'm just going to stick to that rather than waffle on. I would weave your values or your organisation's values into the design of the solutions and your change programme. So on this programme I mentioned before that was sort of across the globe, in the programme charter, there was a page with the company values and what that meant for how we would work in the team. And we workshopped it, we documented it, and we brought it up each quarter to make sure we were happy that we were still living those ways of working. So just consider how your values manifest in your communications, in your leadership, and in the way that you reinforce behaviour.
Yeah, No, that makes sense. And I think, that there's one key thing that leaders can do locally as well. And, sometimes things happen, right? And where practices do differ, address them openly. So it's about encouraging people to speak out where they're seeing processes or behaviours that they think or feel are against organisational values. We can walk in each other's shoes, and genuinely I believe that most people recognise that sometimes even leaders have to make decisions that they don't like for good reasons. And the key is to listen. So people just want to be heard and feel that they've been heard a lot of the time. Okay, so we're now going to move on to our final factor. Take a deep breath. We're there. It's the final one. So we're coming back to Adrian, and Adrian is experiencing an absence of fairness. Lucy.
Thanks, Sasha. Okay, so Adrian has spent more time working from home than some of his colleagues, and in recent promotions he felt overlooked because he wasn't as physically present as others. He's asked for feedback and it didn't feel balanced or honest, and he says it's unfair. Now, remember, absence of fairness could be actual or it could be perceived. Either way, it's real because it's real for the person experiencing it. And that could be a perceived inequality in workload, pay, having a voice, or maybe even if change is unfairly distributed and there are winners and losers. Sasha, have you come across this fairness issue? What would centres do?
Yeah, I have, and it's tricky from a central perspective. It's more about balancing the kind of communication perspectives, right? So balancing those kind of big picture macro as well as the kind of local messaging to help people understand the broader business implications. Because sometimes there are winners and losers in change programs and in organisations. That is a genuine truth. And I think also having a single source of the truth, so being really transparent about what's happening and the challenges and the benefits of change and how you're tracking those and making decisions sometimes can be helpful. So having all those latest facts and figures available in one source on a company website, that gives people the ability to ask questions and kind of understand for themselves. And I think, using things like human-centric design centrally, so design thinking and letting people co-design stuff, and really focus on it, as you've talked about before, co-design how we actually implement changes in a way that makes things better for local teams can be helpful. It's not going to address Adrian's specific issue, but in general, it will help.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we can remember that being treated differently may not always mean you're being treated unfairly. So treating people fairly can actually mean treating them differently depending on individual circumstances and needs. So what leaders on the ground can do is just seek to understand what myths and challenges are coming up in a particular audience early so that messages can be tailored to them and decisions explained.
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, again, being honest and open about these things just makes a massive difference and people feeling that they've been heard. So it's similar to the previous one. Okay, so thank you. Thanks, Lucy, and thanks to anyone that's been able to share in the chat. I know Lucy's having a little look now to see what's going on and if there's anything that we can build on. We've been through all 6 of the factors that were developed by Maslach and her team. And I guess if you take nothing else away from today, there's a set of hacks that we're just going to go through now, just to kind of help reinforce in your own mind some of the ideas that we've talked about today. So for lack of control, we're suggesting that you help reduce the chaos by having that portfolio view of projects or change, so that people are not guessing around priorities and they are able to focus on what really matters and ideally stop doing the rest. For lack of community, that's leveraging the shared struggle. So within parameters, letting your people tackle some of the sticky issues and maybe co-creating solution options and, having the opportunity to shape things that impact them so that they feel engaged and part of something. For insufficient reward, this is an easy one. Say thank you regularly and mean it, and maintain that open door policy for discussions. Work overload, much less easy. So maybe co-designing a charter for the kind of wellness and well-being of the organisation, stopping from the top. So really walking that walk. Conflict in values. We talked about where practices differ, really address openly. People do get that leaders sometimes have to make difficult decisions that even they may not like. So talk about it. And then finally, absence of fairness. So training leaders and HR around things like psychological safety, where leaders are open and really share their vulnerability to make people feel comfortable talking about how they feel and issues that they may have, and really helping to foster that culture of transparency and openness.
And actually, Sasha, if I can kind of cut across you there, I think that's a really important point to linger on, and we've had a good couple of points in the chat around leadership role modeling across all of this stuff is so important, you know, just to not to add on the pressure, but what we do as managers and leaders does get seen by others and have an effect. But actually, with this absence of fairness and this culture of transparency and openness, Nina's put a really good point around just explaining decisions clearly can make a big difference. So much angst can come from Chinese whispers or uncertainty, or just the impression that people aren't being honest with you. Whereas even if you don't like the decision that's been made, if it's been explained with the justification openly and they can trust that they'll be given the truth, then that goes a long way.
It does, massively. Thank you.
Brilliant. So those are just some hacks, 6 things to stop now, in case you're drowning in the information that we've given you today. But my soapbox is this one simple hack. For those of you who joined us last year, you'll remember that this was a key message that we emphasised a lot. So that was our webinar on resilience. And I think it still applies now, perhaps even more so. You cannot pour from an empty cup. To lead and support others through change effectively, you have to take care of yourself as well. Just let that linger. So that's enough of the content. We're going to stay on until past for questions and things. So thanks for your attention. But what we're really curious to get is there one thing that you're going to do differently from today, or perhaps if that's too much of a commitment, that you'll think about doing differently or suggest to a colleague that we can do differently in a team? Same as before, pick up your phone, open your camera app, scan the QR code, and it'll take you to a different Mentimeter. Or Sasha has dropped the link in the chat, and that should take you to the same question. What are you going to do differently? Thanks for everyone dropping that. That's absolutely fine. Thanks for putting a note in the chat. I'm going to move on and see. This is the final hurdle to see if the technology works. Here we go. Fantastic. Just be more mindful of what's going on. Yeah, consciousness of it is the first step. Block an hour for lunch. This is something that's so easily said, and it's very hard to do. But as someone who does it, say I'll do it for 3 days a week. That's a great start. If you're not taking a lunch break and you just manage to do it 3 days a week, an hour, brilliant progress, and you'll notice the difference. I love this. Link to values in the charter. Stop from the top, try and do that. Oh, brilliant things coming through. Thank you. Schedule a how are you call for Friday. Create a network, all good stuff. We'll hold you to it. No, we can't. It's anonymous. All right.
Yeah, we can try. I can't believe it, but
very quickly then, there's stacks of resources on the Gate One website, and we will ping you out some links to related articles and things. But the main message, folks, is if any of this has struck a chord or you want to know more about it, then just reach out for a conversation. We do a lot of this stuff, so always happy to talk and think through your challenges. You can just get in contact, but those details will be going out after this. So if we may end on a suitably uplifting, if slightly corny quote, thank you very much for joining. We will stay online. Just looking through the chat, I think, but there's no questions at the moment, but we will stay on. Thank you everyone for your time and attention, and we hope you have a fabulous day.
thanks very much, Lucy. So we're going to hang around. So as you grab yourself a cup of tea for the next meeting, if there's any questions before you want to go, then yeah, chat away in the chat, and we'll interact happily.
Actually, I've got a question for you, Sasha. Having now thought through this stuff quite a lot,
yes,
is there something that stands out for you as the thing that resonates most, or your favorite thing to do?
I think, great question. The anticipatory principle is something that I don't think I've really thought about enough and leveraged enough in the teams that I've been working in. I think that's definitely something that I can do more of. The stuff that I can do at a personal level, I really like the idea of setting an hour, whether it's every day or once a week or something, where there's no meetings, and actually using that, whether it's productive work or doing some yoga, going for a walk, whatever it
Something
is that
for you.
do. Yeah, I think I quite like that idea. I think, historically I felt bad blocking out time, right? And you want to be as flexible as you can for everybody and everything. And there's a point at which you have to put yourself first as well. So, so there's one for a team and there's one for me there that I think I'm going to try and leverage a bit more. How about you?
Your client won't know what's coming this afternoon.
No, I can't meet with you at that time. Can't possibly.
I think it's been said in the chat, and we've mentioned it a couple of times, just that whatever behaviour it is, if the leaders can role model it, then that expectation of behaviour trickles down. That's so important, whatever it may be. Listening, recognising others. Actually, I think recognition, it's a word that gets bounced around a lot, but just saying thank you, dropping an email, acknowledging where someone's tried, even if it hasn't even gone well, that's super motivating and can make people feel valued. If you could only employ one strategy, that's what we're trying to discern. That's what we're trying to discern. It's too difficult. I'm picking recognition. I'm picking valuing. People want to feel valued and people want to feel part of something important. So reminding them that they are and thanking them for their effort is, I think, one of the biggest things that you can do as a manager.
Honestly, I think it's purpose. I think, if the priorities are not clear and if, things are really fluid, giving people a bigger picture sense of purpose gives them something to hang everything off and a reason to get out of bed in the morning and a reason to feel excited about doing what they're doing. And it can lead to those feelings of, value and it's just motivating. So I think for me, Jeff, I definitely go with the whole thing around purpose. I think just help people understand why what you're doing is important, and then they can really get on board and have fun with it.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. And I was listening to a podcast with a clinical psychologist, and he was talking about sometimes people find it hard to find purpose in their work when they don't believe that the job is a sort of traditionally world-changing role. But actually, if your purpose can be to learn something or to progress something or to understand how something else works, those kind of purposes are applicable whatever role you're in. So you can find one that's really personal to you in the midst of that.
Yeah, it's a word, isn't it, that it can feel very grandiose and a bit overwhelming sometimes.
Yes.
But, I read recently the Start With Why, the book.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because it is just about why. Why are we doing what we're doing? What difference is it going to make today, this week, this month, this year? You don't have to be a doctor or, you don't have to be in a profession that's overtly altruistic to be doing something good and be doing something that's valuable to somebody.
Actually, there's a nice segue. We've got, sorry, Sasha, to speak across you, we've got a good comment. There's things that I want to put into practice with my team who I worry are showing a number of these signs. Yeah, it's so important. And I think this stuff can be avoided. And so even if you think that your colleagues or staff are on the way to burnout or indeed have that kryptonite of relentless urgency and are finding it difficult to stop because they're addicted to the buzz of that urgency, it can be almost nipped in the bud before it escalates. So don't underestimate the power of making a few small changes or having a few small conversations if you worry that people are on the trajectory, because it is possible to intercept. Really good points. Thanks.
Yeah, and that point you made when you were talking about actually we need to do less. We need to find things that we can stop, as well as add this in, add that in, add the other in. There's a lot of that in our lives. Actually, just recognizing that not everything is really important, and not everything is urgent, definitely. And just giving people the opportunity to deprioritize things and to, kind of throw something out the window, because frankly, there are times when there's just so much that you've got to do that to stay sane. And if as a leader you can help people do that in a really practical way and guide them in that, that's awesome, right?
Well, I tell you what we could do. We could be the example, and on that very pertinent note, finish a couple of minutes early to give people a breather before their 9:30.
Totally. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Right, folks, thank you for your time and attention. We will send out an infographic with the kind of, as an aid memoir, we will send out contact details. Do get in contact if you want to talk further, and have a great day.
Thank you, and thanks, Lucy.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Take care and have a great day.